Hi, everyone. This is the Granite Mountain Movie Club. This is a show where we talk about movies and pop culture primarily from I would say, socially conservative perspective or like just like kind of a right wing perspective. I'm actually curious. So, my guest, I'll let you introduce yourself, but I'd be curious. I don't know. And you've been on the show once before, but how would you describe what this is? I don't necessarily know what it is.
Yeah, I think that works. I mean, I've had my own struggles with am I conservative? Am I right wing? Am I reactionary? And I've definitely decided that the term I'm most comfortable with is reactionary because it doesn't imply anything specifically ideologically besides that you're like angry about what's going on.
Yeah.
And I think like that describes me better than either conservative or right wing. But
Yeah.
I think I'm more right wing than I am conservative, and I'm more reactionary than I even am right wing because I'm sort of ideologically all over the place, but definitely usually reactionary. But I guess reactionary also has an extreme connotation, and I wouldn't think of myself or you as particularly extreme. It's also hard just because I think like my assessment of your perspective is and my own is that in like 1997 it would have been like normal American adult male opinions about everything, and now it's reads fairly right wing. But like,
Yeah, that's I use the term socially conservative. I mean or culturally conservative, that sort of I use that term because I don't have strong feelings about necessarily how certain things are done. Uh but like for me it's like, oh, whoever is going to deliver like no abortions, something like that. Like that's like there's like all these like there's like infighting in various political groups, and I'm like I don't really know which of you it has like the better path. I just, whichever one of you can deliver like the things I want. Like that's what I care about.
sure, that sounds very reasonable. I don't know if you share this perspective, but I feel like I'm more right wing about aesthetics and art than maybe even politics because like I think in a way even if you're like a Bernie lib, like you might just think that like the government redistributing money or providing healthcare is like a way to make families good. But like if the point of your movie is that like meaning doesn't exist,
Yeah.
I sort of find that threatening at a level that I don't find any political position threatening. So it is sort of in the realm of art that I become like the biggest reactionary fuddy duddy.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I've not really thought about it, I guess, quite like that, but or at least for myself. But that is interesting, and that I would say. I mean, I guess I'm kind of equal, like on the actual like policy side and the art side. But I realized I didn't say your name. What's the best way to refer to you?
I'm trying to. I mean, I think the word is out that my name is Evan, but I'm trying to increasingly just introduce myself as at Degree Studies on Twitter and the host of the Two
Yeah.
Minute Hate podcast, so that over the eons, my internet the internet records of my Twitter persona and my real life persona will hopefully get further and further apart. But yeah, either Evan or Degree Studies is fine.
Yeah, so anyone listening to this who's not acquainted with Evan, go follow him on Twitter. I will put like the link in the description, and I'll put a link to his podcast as well. Your podcast is just really good. Like I mean, the main format that I mean, I listened I think almost every episode, and it's it's not quite like it's not quite like a audio essay because there's like some I can hear you thinking on the spot sometimes. So it's obviously not like scripted, but your thoughts are always well organized. So it's kind of like a free flowing audio essay. That's kind of how I take it. You're usually solo. Sometimes you have guests on, but everyone listening to this, go subscribe to the show. I mean, what's the best place to do? Like the SoundCloud, you put stuff out there, but should people go to
Yeah,
Apple
it
or?
goes to SoundCloud first, but yeah, I think most people who listen subscribe on iTunes. And yeah, often I think I'm at least what my friends have told me is that like I think I have pretty good uh like I could definitely pass a liberal Turing test. So like
Yeah,
a lot of times when issues come up in uh, I don't know, in Twitter discourse in society, I think I can do like a pretty good faith rendering of being like, I think whoever's, you know, up to something, like with this Kanye thing that I think we're gonna talk
yeah,
about. Although actually maybe I was sort of dismissive about people who were being concerned about Kanye's comments and what they will mean for like the safety of Jewish people. I was pretty dismissive of that. But I think in general I will like frame an idea, say what I take to be the general understanding, and then sort of explain my thinking of how I got to maybe in most cases like slightly disagreeing with the general framing. But I at least try to do like a non-insulting job of rendering what I take to be the motives and like assumptions of whatever I'm disagreeing with. But probably in some episodes I do a better job than others.
yeah, so yeah, you referenced your most recent episode, so I'll set the stage a little bit here. So this episode that the audience is listening to now, we're going to talk about two of the worst criminals in American history. So we're going to talk about the new Netflix show about Jeffrey Dahmer, the notorious serial killer, and the other worst criminal of modern history, Kanye West. So we're going to talk about those two guys primarily. So yeah, you had this recent episode on your podcast, which I found really interesting because I'm not like I haven't consumed, I only consume rap like passively. But you had this episode explaining some of like the history and relationship between uh, some rappers and uh, their views on Judaism. Do you
Yeah,
remember?
so like the TLDR of the episode was basically just that if you've listened to rap, and I have, you know, I don't know that I would like it's not the genre of music that I like the most, let's say, but I have followed it and I probably cared about it a lot more when I was younger. And like I'd say really early rap, or I guess this isn't the earliest rap, but rap in the '90s, it was like very common to hear like straight up anti-Semitic tropes in rap, like about the Jews controlling the world and stuff. But what changed, in my view, from listening to a lot of rap is not actually like the view of Jews that was present, but just the tone in which it was characterized. So like very early rap was like negative about the fact that Jews controlled the world, but then a lot of rappers started being like, "Oh, my producer, my agent is Jewish. Like this is awesome. Like I'm mobbed up with the Jewish business people." And like it almost reminds me, I didn't say this on my podcast, but it made me think of I don't know if you've ever known, like something I saw in high school was like there might be a jock who like hates nerds, but then the nerd like helps a bunch of jocks
Yeah,
cheat on a test, and then
yeah,
the jocks are like, "Oh, this guy is actually awesome. Like we love having you know, four eyes over here in our corner cuz like he can get shit done that we can't get done." And that was sort of the attitude that rappers took in lyrics to like Jewish business people, like, "Oh, this is awesome. Like if you're well connected to Jewish people in the music industry, like they can ease the path for you." So all of that is just to say that like I don't think Kanye's attitude is actually unique at all from the milieu he comes from. He's just saying like he's now decided again that maybe it's bad, whereas like Jay Z and Puff Daddy think that it's great because they have a lot of powerful Jewish friends, but like they probably have like a very similar conspiratorial view. But also, and I guess I didn't say this too clearly on my podcast, like I don't really blame them because it's like if you're like a working class person and then you go into an industry that is dominated by a particular American minority, I don't think it's that weird for you to be like, yeah, these are powerful people
yeah.
and you have to like care about what they think.
Hmm.
um
Yeah, you'll hear those comments from someone who maybe services an industry that's like dominated by Koreans or something, that's like, oh, I have to deal with these Koreans.
Yeah, and it's like they have like inscrutable cultural mores and like social networks that I don't know about, and they have their own like internal social competition that's a little weird. Like this is another thing I didn't get into on my podcast, but I think one of the things I was trying to say to maybe like mainstream liberal white people is that like they don't have access to how like brown America views Jews.
Hmm.
Because like I used to have a job where I worked in political advocacy for like an Arab community. Like essentially I was working for Syrian Americans, like helping them get politically organized and like run candidates and stuff. And one of the things I would always ask people, if I was at like a fundraiser or something, is I'd be like, because if you're in like a small ethnic political organizing, you're always modeling yourself after the Jews because they are the most successful identity based community lobby in the history of the United States. So it's like you look at groups like APAC and you say, okay, we want to do that for Chinese people or whoever. But in my case, it was Syrians and more broadly Arabs. So I'd always ask Arabs and fundraisers. I'd be like, what percent of white people in America do you think are Jewish? And they'd always be like 20, 25%.
Yeah.
And you tell them like it's 1%. And
Yeah.
they couldn't believe it. And weirdly, like that would make them even more conspiratorial because then they'd be like, so why like is it so important as like a political interest group? And you say, well, they're just really well organized and really well funded and they've been doing it for a long time. So like I don't know, I wouldn't join Kanye in saying like DEFCON 3 or whatever, but it's a little weird to be asked to not acknowledge the sort of like extremely conspicuous success of this group. Now I don't attribute it to like malicious motives or conspiracy or anything, but it's like, if 1% of your population has like they've contributed to a lot of the great artistic achievements, they're really prominent in entertainment and politics, like it's just conspicuous and it does seem sort of unique because if you say, for example, like I've heard people say like folks who work in tech, they'll be like, oh, there's a lot of Brahmin Indian immigrants
Hmm.
that are like CEOs, like, oh, that's a very small group in America, but right now they have like 3 CEOs out of the 10 biggest tech companies. And like all you're really saying is that like this little minority recent immigrant community has really got its roots down in like a successful way. Like if you say that, no one says like, okay, so you think there's an international Brahmin Indian conspiracy and you want to Holocaust them. It's like, no, they're just conspicuously successful in America.
Yeah.
Like,
I think one challenge in understanding it, a lot of people would probably push back on this, or say it's like, I don't know, it's white supremacy or something, that I don't even see it. But I do genuinely think a lot of like white Anglo type people don't, they have a hard time understanding, I think, because they don't really actively engage in it. Like they don't really do it. And maybe they do, and maybe I'm just, I never got into the right frat or something. But um
well, no, the WASPs are the only people who ever really believed in the blank slate, and
yeah.
and sometimes they assume that the rest of us that they brainwashed, like really internalized the blank slate, but we didn't.
Yeah.
Because like I'm definitely from a place where I got full WASP programming, but it's just impossible to not be like, well, I'm Irish Catholic and my family's doing well, but like half my cousins are layabout drunks, and like I have a lot of Jewish friends and none of their cousins are layabout drunks. Like
Yeah.
you just notice these things.
Yeah. So I'm LDS, and sometimes people, they'll say stuff like, oh, well, there's in-group preference among Mormons, and I'm sure there is, but it's like, I wish we, and I tell people this all the time, I wish we could figure it out. Like I wish we could do what is seen in other communities, but I think we have too much of that. Like if you look at like a DNA map of America, like where people came from, Utah has a high concentration of like Anglo and Nordic ancestry, and it's like they just have that mentality. They're kind of like no, you need to go earn stuff. Like if I have like relatives that are that have very lofty job titles at very important places, and if I email them and be like, hey, can you help me get an like I just applied, can you just make sure the hiring manager sees my resume? They're just kind of like, I'll see what I can do. But it's like, but if I ask like just like a bro from my grad school, if I say, hey, bro, just guy that I know, can you help me make sure that they see my resume? He's like, of course, bro, I'll do that. Bro, you got it, bro. And it's
Well,
like,
that's interesting because I know that people who are really interested in the culture stuff do say that wasps do not show in-group preference, or they don't like glad hand and do the like low-level corruption the same way that other groups do. But one thing I was trying to say in my podcast too is like from an Irish Catholic perspective in the Northeast, I was almost viewing Jewish people as like more fully assimilated to WASP striver culture than my people were. Because
mhm.
it's like, oh, the people that built this place are like bookish and very serious and very successful, and they don't spend their money on stupid shit. And like Jews are exactly like that, and like the Irish Catholics, like some of us are living up to that, but not nearly as many as the Jews. So like, but I mean, maybe you're right. Maybe it is the case that like Jews as a more recent immigrant group were more comfortable like helping one another out. But I don't know, because to me it always seemed like from the outside looking in, it always seemed like maybe wasps wouldn't push someone's resume forward because they saw like a old New England name. But it's like even if they wouldn't do favors, they knew who each other were. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's still, you see those networks where it still helps, the like attracts like and things like that. But the kind of people and I will say I have had, problems getting them to actually help me, that I would say for them, it's like they don't want to appear, they just think it seems a little like low, to like,
sure. No, and I think that's a respectable position, but it's just good to know, or I would say globally that like in that instance, let's say that like an old WASP person like won't help his friend's kid get into Princeton, and a Jew would. It's like I would just say that at the global level, then the Jew is being normal and the WASP is being weird, and
yeah,
like
I think so too.
maybe because they set the tone in America, we don't see it that way, but like it's odd to not have that kind of low level in group favoritism. And I guess that is supposedly a thing that distinguishes the people that founded America. And I definitely like I can see it as sort of like an admirable thing, but like I don't really relate to it. Like I would ruin a company to get my to get my cousin a job. But
Yeah.
I'm Ellis Island trash, so that's as advertised, I guess.
I don't know if you saw it, but uh regarding Kanye, I assume it was like happened this morning or last night or something, but did you see him with his phone where he held up like that
Yeah, it's like a
spreadsheet?
spreadsheet of.
Yeah.
Well, this is why I think it's so explosive, and like I want to keep things reasonable on your podcast. It's like to be clear, like I'm not a believer in the global Jewish conspiracy, but I do have this feeling of like how much do you guys want to push back on him when he's like in a literal sense obviously correct? And it just feels weird like I suspect it is the case if Kanye could list the sort of like identity origins of every person he's interacted with who got to make decisions about how his stuff was distributed, like what platforms it was on, whether or not he got a deal, how his stuff's going to be marketed. Like
Hmm.
2/3 to 3/4 of those people are going to be Jewish. Now, does that give is that cause for Kanye to be mad about it or to lump them all into a group and say that they're like against him. I don't know, but it just feels weird if he's saying like uh a truly exceptional number of music executives are Jewish. It's like, do you really want to fight him on that? Like, he's obviously right. I don't know.
Kind of what defines what makes a normie, I guess, is that they have that capacity to like not put two things side by side and honestly compare them. But it is some, I mean, at least for some people, something's going to break at some point when like this prevailing, there's a prevailing narrative uh wherein like any inequality or inequity is explained by like racism or something, except the following inequities. It's like that's got to break in someone. Like most normies, I guess, are not going to. They're not going to honestly evaluate that at any point, but at least some of them are. I mean, and
Right.
Kanye deciding to go off is gonna introduce at least some new people to these ideas.
Right. And like, I think that in a very real and important way, George Soros is a massive anti Semite. Because, like, if I notice that there's a lone Jewish billionaire, like, funding DA races all over the country to get the DA to be much more progressive uh, than the population who's voting there would want, like, it is not me noticing that plays into anti-Semitic tropes. It is George Soros doing that
Mhm.
plays into anti-Semitic tropes. And it's like, if he cares about that, he should be like, all billionaires should be careful about the degree to which they put their thumb on the scale in especially like small dollar political races, because it's like, yeah, people are going to think you're meddling, and if you're from a community where the reputation about you is that you meddle, then like you should be extra careful to not meddle. You shouldn't meddle at the most aggressive rate anyone has ever meddled, and then like, if people talk about this, they're racist. Like that. And I think one of the reasons I'm so indignant about this is that like, I just feel like, I don't know. It's like all the pogroms, the Holocaust. It's like that didn't happen here. The whole history of the United States, like maybe we should have taken more refugees during World War II, but it's like, I grew up with Jews. I still have a lot of Jewish friends. I think this country is like unique in the history of the world in being a place that Jews could come and thrive. And I just think still applying this omerta to us, of like, you can't notice these things when we have such a good, because I don't know, this isn't Germany. It's like, maybe in Germany we shouldn't make these observations because there's actually like, I don't know, evidence that your population could turn in some ugly way. But I feel like Americans, we should have more goodwill than that, based on our history and especially our recent history, to be like, no, this isn't about to turn into the Fourth Reich. Like, it's not. Anti-Semitism isn't deep here the same way it is in Europe, and so I think it's in the same way that we can say like, oh, this certain caste of Indians has come over and is really dominating in tech, and when you say that, no one thinks you're starting a campaign to drum Indians out of America. I think we should have similar like leadway, but obviously like, I mean, sort of proving the point. Everyone who matters disagrees with me, and just like Kanye and just like Charlemagne the God, I am sort of like nervous to even be in
Yeah,
those waters because it's just like not worth it. But yeah,
yeah.
that's how I feel.
Hey, we are back from like a technical difficulty, but I think Evan was just summarizing some of his thoughts on the Kanye situation where we ended off right before our technical issue. But yeah, if there's anything else you wanted to touch on before we move on to the other thing, was there anything else you wanted to get into?
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to say about Kanye, and I think I hope I'm understood on this point, but I guess like we'll see how it comes across. But I guess I just think like, I think the threshold for how you talk about like Jewish people and Jewish influence is like a little lower to assume someone has malicious intent than for other minority groups. Like I think you could, like I said, you could talk about Indian Brahmins, or you could talk about Chinese immigrants to America and talk about their success or how they're succeeding in a certain industry, and this would not be taken as malicious, like as if you had, hate in your heart or whatever people say. It's like the most sensitive people, the most left wing people might take issue with it, but most Americans would be like, yeah, you can take that, you can make that observation, whatever. And I think for sort of historical reasons related to the Holocaust and other things, speech around Jewish Americans has been particularly sensitive. But I just think, based on the fact that this country has recently been and continues to be an extremely hospitable place for Jewish people, I kind of just wish Kanye and others would have the room to speak like this if they wanted, and it not be assumed that they're trying to drum up a genocide. Because I honestly think Kanye is like raging against speech prohibitions and like certain dynamics present in the industry he's in, and like even if he's inartful or offensive in how he expresses that, I just am never going to believe that he like wishes harm to Jewish people. And I know the argument is that like, well, he may not, but his speech increases an atmosphere, like blah blah blah. I just don't really believe that either. Um,
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, my main impression of it is like, and I've seen people where people are speculating on this, and it's probably just it probably I think it has a lot to do with this, but it's like, in his industry, and also given, he's like, is he divorced or he's going through a divorce or something? He's dealing with, he's just like he's in an area where it's concentrated with a lot of people who are Jewish. Like he's dealing with a lot of lawyers, a lot of like record label type people, people in the entertainment business, and it's like, uh, so he's, first of all, he's pointing that out, but second of all, a lot of this, you could say is like personal. It's just like maybe he's sick of certain people that he's working with, and he's like, okay, well, I'm just going to blow this up, because I know you guys are sensitive about this, so I'm gonna bring it up. And but I don't know. I don't know. I've just seen people sort of speculating about that, like, oh, your wife got a Jewish lawyer or something like that, so you're mad. But
yeah, he seems like a person who would always rage against anyone who tried to control his art, anyone who tries to control his speech,
yeah,
anyone who was sort of like a middleman in his businesses who meant that he couldn't do exactly what he wanted to do all the time. And I think it just so happens that being in entertainment, a lot of those people might be Jewish. And as you say, he may be sort of lashing out because he's upset with those people at the moment. But yeah, I mean, it is what he is. It is. I'm always sort of like worried for him because he does seem like he's very prone to like provoking people. And on the one hand, he knows what he's doing, but on the other hand, he like, he gets himself in difficult corners. So, I just wish him the best, and wish people would sort of cut him some slack.
yeah. My kind of last thing on this is I'm just really curious to see who else he gets to kind of go along with him, if anyone. But um, the technical delay in our recording here has actually been a couple days, so we're resuming after a couple day break, and I think over the weekend or something, I think Kyrie Irving was pressed by some reporters about some things he believes and has said, and I think there was someone else who had, um,
Yeah,
oh
Kyrie like tweeted out some movie that I guess was sort of in the black nationalist or Nation of Islam tradition, and had a big focus on Jewish involvement in the slave trade.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and like that's another funny thing because it's like, I mean, I'm sorry, I read history. Jews were involved in the slave trade, and it's weird because if you're an American white person, you're like supposed to do all this soul searching about. I mean, I'm Irish. I didn't have ancestors who owned slaves, but like I am expected to do soul searching. But Jews, sort of among white people, are, because they have this whole like global conspiracy thing that they can say they need to be afraid of. It's like, oh, you can't even talk about the historically accurate role of certain Jewish people in the slave trade. And it's like, well, that's weird because like one of our big things now is we ask white people to think about slavery and the sort of like stain on our history or whatever. So
Yeah, that's the next stage that I'm really interested in, to see who ultimately like will go along with him. I know, like I think it was J.R. Smith, so I guess so far there's like two basketball players, but uh like J.R. Smith had like quote tweeted Kanye something like, "Oh, this is interesting," just like getting a little signal there. But
yeah, I do think that one thing that like I may have said this in the last time we recorded, and I may have said it on my own podcast too, but it's like I think that white liberals are constantly disappointed with how little the like brown communities they think of as their as like clients,
yeah,
that like they don't really take on the worldview. And so
Mhm.
like do you remember there was a sort of like there's like a black Christian guy who he was at MSNBC for a while, and he just it kept coming up that he had these like homophobic screeds on his like personal blog.
was
And they
it was it Mark Lamont Hill? I don't remember, but
no, it was before him. It was like a similar kind of figure, but this guy was like an ex-pastor, and
okay.
he kind of just kept saying like, "Yeah, I'm a black pastor. Do you think I'm gonna like support gay marriage?" And finally, they just axed him. But it's like, yeah, you, and this is where they're sort of the whole like token game they play like reaches a point of contradiction, because it's like on the one hand they want people on TV that represent the genuine perspective of these client communities, but they also don't find the client community perspective particularly acceptable. So like they're always sort of dancing around that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. Watch this space. It'll be interesting. Okay, let's switch gears then to something more. I was gonna make a joke and say something more lighthearted, but people would probably be offended by that. But switch gears to something else, which is the I guess it's like the most popular Netflix show ever, or like the second most after Stranger Things. But Stranger Things and Squid Game. I get, but
That's shocking to me.
I think it was like for first season viewership, or for like when a property was new, it's like done. It's performed as well as everything except for like Stranger Things season 4 or something. But yeah, so it's this show Dahmer, this new Dahmer show, which the official name is kind of funny. It's Dahmer, and then the next line is Monster: the Jeffrey Dahmer story. Before we kind of talk about it, I was wondering, and I got into this on the last like podcast, but we only talked about this show for like a couple minutes, and only I had seen it. But what what's your take on just like the rise of like true crime, and I mean, there's all these true crime podcasts, but like serial killer dramatizations have been with us, for a long time, and it's like this continuing fascination. But what's your take on like the genre in general?
Do you remember this show on Fox called Millennium? It was made by the people who made
X Files, right?
X
It's
Files.
Chris Carter. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so I've been watching some reruns of this, and what's funny is there's an episode. This show was out in 1998, and there's an episode where they make fun of. I was just watching it this past weekend. There's an episode where they make an allusion to people who are too into true crime, and they use the phrase true crime, and they sort of refer to these people as losers. And like I had to rewind it because I was very surprised. Like I didn't remember that being a thing in the culture, like in the 90s, that there were people who were. I thought that was sort of like a recent thing that started with maybe Serial and the Adnan Syed story and all these podcasts. So I guess it's like a longer trope in culture than I had remembered.
Well, yeah, it used to be like literal like dime store books, or at least like these cheap paperbacks that were just like lurid tales of from the highway or something. It's like the Highway Killer, and like those have been around. I'm aware of those going back to like the 50s and stuff.
Right. And it's like so many things where it's sort of like a subculture that none of us had to deal with if we weren't in it in the pre-internet age. is sort of like given nuclear jet fuel by the internet, and it becomes a thing that like we all have to contend with. I guess I would say that um, true crime stuff, like serial killer stuff, school shooting stuff, it's like a real cipher for whatever's people's pre-existing opinions about society are, and I think this Dahmer show is a real example of that. Like, I think there's been a lot of stuff about school shootings and serial killers, like from a more right leaning perspective, where it's like these are demons in the world. This is what happens
Hmm.
when you have like a godless, nihilistic society. But then there are also these other attempts to make it more like, oh, this is the result of mass media and
A repression of some type.
yeah, yeah. And I think it's like because we can't understand this violence and because it's so terrifying and demands an explanation, it's like a very ripe environment for ideologues of whatever variety to just sort of fit the story into their preferred narrative. And again, I think this show is an example of that. But I guess that's a little bit separate from the phenomenon of just like women who like, and I guess this wouldn't apply to Dahmer at all, but like with true crime podcasts, it seems to be a real thing that like women love stories about men killing random women
Hmm.
where like they feel like it could be them. Like
Yeah.
for whatever reason, this is very exciting to women. And I would guess, this is going to be my reactionary perspective on everything, but like I would guess that as society sort of constrains men to be less and less physically aggressive in spaces they share with women and children, women are probably will just grow more and more desirous of like some contact with a totally unrestrained violent man. So in other
Hmm.
words, like the more sort of uh, feminized and androgenized mainstream culture is, and the less acceptable it is for a man to be like domineering or even just aggressive in public, probably the more these stories will have like a powerful niche because it's something people connect with and maybe is not easy to get access to in your real life.
Yeah, and I've seen more than a few women joke about something like, oh, I wish someone cared enough about me to stalk me and kill me or something. Like, and it's a joke, but it's also like there's something in that joke that they kind of mean it. Like, it's better to be stalked than just ignored completely. So,
Well, right, and I think there is something too there where like the most successful man and a serial killer or a school shooter or a terrorist have a lot in common. It's just sort of like where their energy is directed.
yeah.
Like I think the most attractive man, the man you would imagine as like a hero, is a man who is able to ignore social mores and the people around him to be entirely single-minded about something he wants to do. But in the good version of the story, it would ultimately be something that's like pro-social. They want to make a political change or they want to start a business. But
Hmm.
like but they're able to shut out the moral and social concerns of the world and ignore them and not feel bound by them in the same way that some criminals are. So I think like that overlap can account for some of the attraction. And again, I would say further, it's like again, we don't really let men act as the pro-social version of this either. So it's like maybe in the past there would be more stories about like domineering men who are just doing good things, and
Hmm.
perhaps some women would be titillated by that. But I think those stories are like, I mean, I guess there's still movies like that, even like superhero movies might be that to some extent, but it's a perversion of the heroic figure. um
Yeah. Yeah. One thing so the interesting thing here too about Dahmer too, because I'm curious. It was obviously very popular on Netflix, but I wonder how like true crime obsessed women felt about it. Maybe they went into it not just knowing he was a serial killer, but then within the first episode, it's like, oh, he doesn't care about women at all. I wonder if that. I wonder if they became less interested once they
Well, right.
realized.
I would think it's one of the reasons it's weird to me that it's popular is it seems like it would alienate all types of true crime fans. Because even if you're not a person who's titillated, because I would say I'm generally interested in like serial killer movies because I think the question of what are this person's motivations is like a genuinely interesting and troubling question. And
Mm-hmm.
that's like why I hated this show so much. Is like it seemed like it felt like Jeffrey Dahmer's not interesting. He's just kind of like a sad sack loser who, for whatever reason, needed to like kill people to deal with that. But really, what we're interested in is like how society responded to him. And to me, it just seemed like a totally insufficient exploration of his psychology. And so if you're drawn to these things because you want to understand more about the psychology of killers, it's like not only did this show sort of fail to explore that adequately, it seemed like it genuinely did not want to try and do that.
What I've kind of been seeing, and just based on my own, like, anytime I watch something that's based on a true story, I find myself like Googling while I'm watching it, like, oh, did this, this thing really happen or whatever. And well, like this Dahmer show is not completely faithful compared to most things. It's actually a lot more accurate to the real events. Now, going back to something you said a moment ago, they people use these stories as a way to talk about whatever it is that matters most to them. And in this case, that is, like racial injustice. So that's, in 2022, you're going to make a Dahmer show. The main idea of the show is going to, some way or another, going to be racial injustice. But
Yeah, I would even go further and say that like the thesis of this show is that if you listen to black people, nothing bad will happen.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, that was a big, yeah. Like listen to black women was the main sort of idea of the show.
yeah, or
Um,
black gay men sometimes, but mostly women.
yeah, yeah, it's like that mug. It's like quiet. A black woman is speaking. Um, if only the officers in the show had that mug, they would have been they would have solved the case. So, so it, I will say that from what I can tell, the show actually was. I don't know if they wanted to say anything really, other than just sort of. I mean, well, they obviously wanted to say the stuff about like the social conditions of the time and place, but they other than that, I don't know if they. Yeah, I didn't discern any real effort to tell us anything about why this guy did what he did or was the way that he was. Um,
Well, right, and maybe I'm coping now, but it's like the show would have us believe, like, kind of the explanation that they throw at us is like, well, he was a little bit of a loner, and his dad tells us that he also had violent fantasies, and then they did this thing where they bonded by doing taxidermy of roadkill, and just all these little things add up and up and up to him eventually needing to kill and eat people. And like, again, maybe this is my cope because I'm sort of religious or whatever, but like I don't accept that you could have like a fairly normal family life where the worst thing is like a heated divorce, but like both your parents like love you and are invested in you, and you even have a grandmother who like wants to take you to church. Like I have a hard time believing that that could be the family environment of someone who kills and eats like a dozen people. But maybe that's my cope, that I need it to have been worse than that somehow.
yeah, I mean, in my limited understanding of, I've had true crime phases where I was more interested in this stuff, and I've seen plenty of movies and stuff. And like I've read the book that that show Mindhunter is based on. Um, I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say that like all these guys, all the famous killers, um, they all have families, probably as well, probably worse than Dahmer's family. They're all pretty bad. A lot of them, the show does not really suggest he was like beaten really or anything, but
Yeah, I basically thought from like my totally casual like Wikipedia reading that like sexual abuse was almost always indicated when people end up like this. But maybe that's
yeah, and I think but yeah, so his at least compared to others, his upbringing was better than average for these guys. So yeah, there's nothing you could see in there that would naturally like conclude you that would naturally lead to what he became. Um, so yeah, the show doesn't even really try to do that. And I guess they probably told themselves, well, we're just going to tell this mostly straight down the line, of what we believe actually happened. And the only place they really take much license is with side characters and some of the like the political things happening outside of Dahmer himself. But you kind of you've said basically that you didn't really like it.
I thought it was so boring.
The initial critique I have of almost every Netflix thing is that they're just weirdly long. Like added it up, I looked through the episode list. It was like over 500 minutes, I think, like 530 minutes, I think. Yeah, so 9 hours. I could see enough there for like 4 hours, but I don't see how they get 9 hours out of like that story.
I see enough there for 0 minutes. And sorry for interjecting, but it's like the thing is there's not a single interesting character in the show because like Dahmer, who is like I've said is not the character the show's most interesting in, but it's like it's a boring portrayal. They seem to think there's something delicious or interesting about having him portrayed as sort of like a ineffectual like median IQ Midwestern guy. And like maybe they're taking that from real life, but it's boring. There's nothing interesting. And then all the foils and like the dad is also not interesting because he's like I don't know. There could be such an interesting character there, and I think that guy. I'm blanking on his name, but the guy who plays the father, I think, is a really good character actor. But like this performance, because even the thing at the end where like he sort of brings up that he had violent fantasies and like thinks he might be genetically responsible, like that's fairly interesting on its face, but just the way it plays out, I don't know. It doesn't work. It's boring. And then all the black characters are like perfectly heroic, like
Yeah.
so much so that they're. I guess what I'm saying is like there's not a single character that reads as fully human. Like Dahmer is a vacant monster. His father is like such a sort of uh, repressed dumbass that like he's not interesting. And then the black people are just so immediately aware of exactly what's going on and so admirable in their behavior, like in all ways that they're presented, that they're also not interesting. And so like it's just like I didn't care about any character,
Hmm.
and wasn't interested to like, oh, show me more about what that person's thinking, why they're doing what they're doing. Like is just
Yeah.
boring.
I c- um I think I agree with all of that. Other than the dad, I found his dilemma interesting. Just that situation of like I now know my son is one of the is the worst person I've ever encountered. But like, how do I navigate that? And it's like, and they depict him as trying quite hard to like. It's I mean it's strange. It's kind of strange too because
But
he's
yeah,
like.
I couldn't swallow it. Like I feel like I think the actor's name is Richard Jenkins.
Mhm.
It's like I couldn't accept him or the stepmother because it's like they'd have us believe that Molly Ringwald. People are like, oh, Molly Ringwald was so great in this. It's like you want me to believe that like a red-blooded, normal American Midwestern Christian woman marries this guy. It's a second marriage. She thinks he's not tough enough on his son. And then years into their marriage, it comes out that he's like the most prolific gay serial killer in the history of the known universe, and they stay together. Like if it's true that Jeffrey Dahmer's stepmother stayed with Jeffrey Dahmer's father after this all came out, then that woman is a tremendous weirdo. And like you cannot just play her as like, oh well, this is what happened. Like I'm Miss Western, so I stay by my man. Like no way.
But I think that is basically true. So I don't know. But
I
they
just
do.
think the dad and the mom have to be weirdos in real life. And like I understand that maybe the media's read in like the 80s or 90s, because like don't you think at that time it was much easier to hide from like whatever local journalist came to interview you that you're a total freak?
Oh,
Like
sure,
that's
yeah.
sort of my assumption, that like these people are actually nuts, but they successfully, because the media was interested in this angle of like, can evil just appear? Because I think today, if there is Jeffrey Dahmer, the first thing you do when you went to the house is you'd be like, so when did you start molesting this kid? Because like this is how you. But I think maybe in the 80s or 90s, like law enforcement, journalists were all more gullible to just be like, evil appeared in Jeffrey Dahmer, and like no one knows why. And I don't know. I guess I sort of believe evil can just appear in the world too, but I don't know. Like because this sounds really bad, but it's like I think if you're a normatively moral person and you didn't abuse your kid, and then your kid is Jeffrey Dahmer, I think you probably kill yourself. Like I know that's a dark thing to say, but the idea that you would like live and help him with his trials and stuff and like write a book, like no way, man, no way.
Yeah, he's is there like a male term for like a Pollyanna or something? Like the dad is kind of a Pollyanna. Like at least as depicted in the show, he never seems that distraught by what he learns about his son. And they even, I think in one of the earlier episodes, they, and this was probably intentional, but they almost try and make it seem like he was equally disappointed to learn that he was gay as that he was a serial killer.
Yeah,
You know your son was gay, right? And he's just like, his face there is about the same as his face was when he learns that he's a serial killer.
yeah. I think one potential angle that they explored a little but could have been more interesting is like sort of the idea that like when your kid's gay and you don't want them to be gay, you start purposefully not noticing things because you don't want to face the truth about them. And could that environment allow someone to become like a very violent criminal without you noticing, because you're sort of so practiced in like trying to not pay attention to the things they say and like do because you don't want to see their like gay lifestyle, that you're sort of accidentally also missing the signs of violence. I think they touched on that like very briefly in an episode or two, but it wasn't really like we don't really know, for instance, like when he drugs the kid and his grandma is like, I'm gonna stay up,
Mm-hmm.
and we're gonna put this guy on the bus or whatever. It's like we don't really know, like, does she think this is just how gay people roll and like that offends her, or does she think that maybe her grandson is trying to kill this guy or something?
They seem to be implying, at least in the show, um, the grandma knows something is the grandma. I think knows he's gay. I guess because he keeps bringing guys home. Um, but then I think the issue, they make it seem like in that particular instance, which by the way, that part about the bus and stuff is not actually known. The guy went to Dahmer's grandma's house, and then next thing he knew, he was in a hospital. So they made up the bus part just to kind of fill in the gap. But in the show, they make it seem like her hesitation is just about it, like an intoxicated black man. Like she's like, you're bringing drunk black people to my house in the middle of the night. Like that's, my neighbors are going to notice, or that's kind of what they make it seem like her concern is.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't think she. Well, I mean, she knew about the mannequin and some of that stuff, and just that he was just very weird, but and his indecent exposure thing and all that. But
Yeah, I thought that was one of the only interesting things in the show is like I was trying to think like if someone I knew had a mannequin in their room under the covers, like, and they weren't at home, like, what would I conclude
Yeah.
from seeing that? Like, would I think they were attracted to whatever the gender of the mannequin was, or would I think they were just like a total nut job? And I couldn't really decide.
Yeah. Um, so let's we've already alluded to it a lot, but let's talk a little bit about like the social commentary that the show attempts to make. And then from there, after that, I would like to talk about just like the um kind of like the technical aspects, like was it at least was it well made, or we'll talk about some of that. But first, let's get into that some of that social stuff. So like we've talked about, the show is sort of designed to be a reflection on the policing of black communities in the 80s and 90s, and how the I guess the argument of the show is that those communities were let down by um by by racist institutions and individuals. So like
Right. The move the show pulls that I find so disingenuous is it essentially creates a world in which, like, law enforcement is not about like evidence or a balance of rights and security. It's about like intelligence comes from the public, and who you believe and who you don't believe is like the difference between whether crimes get solved or not. So basically, like, at every phase of Dahmer's criminal career, and when he ultimately gets caught, there's like a black foil who sees what he's doing or has some intuition about what he's doing or is exposed to part of what he's doing and goes to the police. And at various points, uh, in various different ways, they're ignored by the police, or the police don't follow up on what they've said needs to be looked into. And I think what's so funny about this kind of is that it's really different than a lot of, because like in a lot of shows, you use the term Pollyanna, like in a lot of shows that focus more on like the over policing of black communities, you'll have sort of like a white Karen going in and
yeah.
being like, you need to like look at these kids, they're up to no good, and there's no real evidence, but then the cops go do and something bad happens. And like this show never really addresses like, because the cops even say things that are totally sympathetic to me, like um the cops say some interesting things, like the thing that what's her name, Glenda Cleveland, who I
Yeah,
guess is a real historical figure, her
kind of. Yeah, she is, but not quite as they show. But yeah.
right, so she's on the show, at least she's Dahmer's neighbor at one point, and at one point Dahmer brings home a 14-year-old Filipino boy, and Glenda Cleveland and her daughter and her niece, I think, call the police and are like, this is a child, he's drunk. And the cops sort of say something like, and Dahmer says, this is my boyfriend. And the
Mhm.
cops say something like, well, we don't really know like how gay people roll. And like the thing I was trying to bring up to you offline, but I didn't say it completely, is like, if you're a cop and like there used to be sodomy laws, but like they haven't been enforced in 100 years, and like now there are like gay bars and stuff, you're in a very difficult position with enforcing crime in the gay community, where it's like, well, a lot of things maybe are like, for example, I'm sure there were conversations in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and probably are still now, that like, I mean, I don't know if anybody ever actually gets like picked up for statutory rape. I think probably you have to have someone call and be like, this old guy is hanging out with this young girl. But it's like when you encounter a couple in the wild,
Mhm.
I'm sure law enforcement gets instructed like, you're going to see bigger age gaps with gay couples than with straight couples, and like you don't necessarily want to like take any action on that, because then you're going to be viewed as sort of like persecuting the gay community. So like the show tries to create a world in which, in, I don't know what it is, 1980s Milwaukee, it would be totally aberrant for like a man in his young 20s to be with a boy who looks 15 or 16, and like the police should be treating this as the extreme situation it is. And like I just assume that's not true. I assume if you went into any gay bar in America in the 70s and 80s, and to a slightly lesser extent now, there'd be teenage boys, and you were probably encouraged to not make a big thing of it because like the gay community is kind of different that way. So this thing that's sort of like the centerpiece of the show, uh, it doesn't even acknowledge that to sort of listen to these black characters that want Dahmer to be arrested. Like part of the reason that didn't happen is because the cops had likely been trained to be sensitive about not being overly judgmental about the behavior of this other minority community. So in fact, it's not that they're like bigots, it's that their hands are tied by trying to manage all these different cultures of which like they don't have direct experience and don't really know what is allowed.
Yeah. And I don't know really anything about that about Milwaukee in that era and about police and gay relations. Um, but yeah, that's the thing about, and I feel like other shows are guilty of this too. But is it the over policing or under policing? Like which one is it today? Like how do we how do we determine like
Yeah,
which?
like this show wants Jeffrey Dahmer to have no civil rights. And like you and I are probably okay with that, but
Yeah.
we also like suspect that the show writers or whatever probably actually aren't. They're just like they haven't fully explored the implications of what they're putting on screen, or
Well,
they haven't thought it through.
one thing the show does over and over, and this is the most manipulative aspect of the show, is that they do take real events, but then they construct like the incident wherein the cops got involved as a little different than how they actually happened to make it worse. So it is factual to say the cops were called about this young boy, the cops knew it, and the cops even arrived on the scene but didn't do anything. That's factual, but like I think the exchange where like they're all outside and it's like exceedingly obvious that the kid was uh being something was happening to the kid. um I don't think it's like that the way they have that framed is not quite really how it wasn't that obvious. It's like
No, right. And the black characters in the show literally have the clarity of knowing what's going to happen, which like no one in real life ever does. Like if I don't know if you've had this experience, but it's like if you've ever called the cops on someone, even if you're really sure that it was the right thing to do, you always have some concern that you're like, am I just blowing this out of proportion? Is this not what I think it is? And it's like
Mhm.
the characters in this show have no doubt that they're right. Like
Yeah.
they're 100% sure.
And based on my like extracurricular readings, the incident with the young Filipino boy, that or I think he was Filipino, right?
I
That
think so,
one
yeah.
that one I'm not as confident in like saying that the show was misleading. I don't know as much about that one, but where they really go for it is just with like Glenda Cleveland's whole story arc where she's like living next door and stuff. It's like she didn't really live next door, right? She lived in a different building, and she sees this guy around and thinks he's suspicious, but um, she wasn't smelling his apartment every day and
Yeah, hearing the screams.
yeah, and he had other neighbors. He had an actual a black woman who lived next door to him named Pamela Bass, and some of the stuff I found indicated that she kind of liked him. Like she thought he was a weird white boy, but they were on okay terms. And there's that
Well, that's
sandwich.
another thing. Like in the show, no one seems fooled or charmed by his sort of Midwestern polite meekness. It's
Yeah,
like he acts that way, but everyone around him just sees through it and is like, "You're a piece of shit. Like, why are you acting nice?" But it's like presumably in real life, some people just thought he was like a quiet, polite guy and maybe kind of
yeah.
appreciated him for
Well,
that.
and you mentioned I think you said median IQ, but and I think you were just using that offhand. But he's like sub median. Like he's definitely which is the
Well, I
we
wondered about that just because the performance makes him seem dumb. So I
yeah.
wondered if that was taken from real life.
Um, I have no reason not to believe it, so I guess I'll say that was accurate. And I think some of the stuff about his like school performance, like he just was very dull. Like he just didn't get stuff that was people just would have just probably just met him and assumed he was just a really like a somewhat handicapped guy. Um,
Right, and like the scenes they play where like his he's sort of getting caught for various things, and like the way he's lying is very childlike. Like when
Hmm.
his dad wants him to open the box and he's like, I lost the key. And then his dad leaves and comes back with a crowbar and he's like, oh, I found it. It's
Yeah,
like, it's not adult level lying.
yeah. Which leads. Oh, no, I was still talking about the Glenda thing. I guess I let me finish that thought. Is
Sure.
so they make it seem, and the real Glenda Cleveland did call multiple times, and they even like have the transcript of one of her calls on the screen. But they they show it as, yeah, like this next door neighbor who's intimately kind of like watching his comings and goings, and like um and and would have definitely known what was going on. But that's not who was calling. It was a distant neighbor, and then his real neighbors. So she's talking all the time about the smell and stuff. But I found this old like article from, it's just I just googled it, but it was on the AP, and it's like they talked to a couple different neighbors, and they're all like, yeah, everything smells here, everything smells bad, like this is just like the worst part of Milwaukee, and our building smells, we hear screaming all the time, we hear gunshots all the time, like we don't, we kind of just tune that stuff out, like we, like they make it seem in the show that it was just painfully obvious what was going on there. um
Right. Because that's another thing. They want us to believe that Dahmer was able to do what he did because he entered a situation of social chaos in which he could do this unnoticed. But because they need all the black characters to seem perfect, they can't actually show any of the social chaos that would have been going on. Because like
yeah,
there can't be other perpetrators of violence or whatever besides Dahmer.
yeah, they can't show people like shooting up in the hallway or something, which
Right, right.
probably would have been there.
So did it say like I'm just curious in the article you happened to read, did it say what Glenda Cleveland happened to observe in real life that convinced her something really bad was going on?
There's a lot written about her, but so I don't remember. But I mean, she's a real person. She was, and I think the real person obviously did have a real instinct that was correct. Um, and it's just, I mean, I know making a show, you want to keep the narrative like a little bit simple, but they probably would have been better served just keeping her in the realistic version of who she was, instead of just making it seem like kind of like a, you know black girl magic or something, just like
Right,
knowing.
because that's potentially an interesting thing they miss too. Because the way they present her, it's like she would have to be stupid to not realize he was a serial killer with what she's exposed to, which is much less interesting than apparently the real story where this person, even at somewhat of a distance, was able to intuit something real. So like I'd be very curious to know what that was, but the show doesn't give us that.
One other thing, this is like they show the cops. They have this like, and I think it's the final episode or second to final episode. They show the cops getting some award as being like police of the year.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
on like the same day that Glenda Cleveland gets some like community award for being involved in the community. The cops didn't get any award. They got fired. They did come back. They were like rehired, and they did get back pay, which I mean, I think they were genuinely not great cops. But I think like some of the things you're pointing out are like policing those kind of neighborhoods is actually quite hard, especially when you're trying to balance like, yeah, something like the over police under police problem. But the show wants us to believe that they were treated like heroes, even though they messed up. But
No, yeah, because a huge contrast is made that like when the police get their award, they're at like a big fancy looking ball, and when Glenda Cleveland gets her award and they're cut to contrast one another, she's in like a basement with folding chairs and like 20 people there. So
yeah,
it's meant to, but it's like that's a particularly annoying detail if it's not based on anything real because it's like so specific.
yeah. And then a big uh a big surprise for me in the show was when Jesse Jackson appears. um
Yeah, I did not know this part of this story
yeah,
either.
and I think it's vaguely real. I mean, I think they make it seem like he got a little more involved than he really did. but he did come to town to sort of like mount a pressure campaign. So that part is vaguely accurate.
Oh yeah, I'm going back a little here, but I just wanted to say for the listeners, the scene I think where you the show really gives away that it's not about real human people is because I was wondering, because Glenda Cleveland confronts Jeff a few times, not about being a murderer at first, but about like you need to resolve this smell. And
Yeah.
I was thinking to myself, like, if she knows that he's a multiple killer, like she's very sure of this, like why is she like with him? Like obviously he's not going to resolve the smell. He kills people. He doesn't care if his neighbors upset at him. And then there's literally a scene later where he's sort of vaguely threatening to her, and
Hmm.
she says, "I'm not afraid of you." And it appears that she is indeed truly not afraid of him. And it's like, unless we're supposed to think this is a superhero, like it wouldn't say anything bad about her if she was afraid. It would be totally rational to be afraid. So like, why does she have to be some like superhuman?
Yeah, they her character is like a 2022 transportation.
I just think it showed like the depth of their commitment to this ridiculous portrayal, because it would have humanized the character and not appeared weak in any way if she was afraid of a man that she knew to be an active serial killer.
Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts on sort of the social context that they try to sort of manufacture for the show?
Yeah, I sort of interrupted you. You were talking a bit about the Jesse Jackson thing. I don't know if you wanted
Well, there's
to.
not much more to say there. That just they make it seem like kind of a big deal, but I think in real life it sounds like he just showed up for a few days, and just because when you're Jesse Jackson, you show up and you get some headlines and you make the mayor and police chief feel uncomfortable, and that's like what you do. That's like all he did.
The thing that's interesting about that, and I'm curious to get your perspective on this, is that that sort of makes it seem like our society, or at least part of our society, was processing Dahmer as a story about race in real time. Whereas my memory of it as a kid is that like Dahmer was listed along with various other prolific serial killers like Ted Bundy, and the things that people would say about Dahmer, like when you're just like talking about it in the cafeteria or something, is that he was gay and that he ate his victims.
Yeah.
I never heard that he like targeted black people or that there was a racial element to this.
Well, that's actually a funny thing. They and I think even I feel like someone in the show says this, and if they don't, I think it's just sort of what the show is sort of implying. But they make it seem like Dahmer, who is pretty dumb, they make it seem like he was like aware of um under policing in this neighborhood, and so he's like, but like from a racial angle, they make it seem like he decided, he's like, okay, well, if I just kill black people, I'll get away with it longer. And they make it seem like he sort of thought that out, and like, you know did the research and like made his decision to like move there. But I don't get the impression that's what really happened. I think he lived roughly where he could afford, possibly noticed that like it was being gay in that area was kind of a free for all in terms of like law enforcement. But they make it seem like a calculated thing, and I don't think it. I have a hard time believing it would have been.
Yeah, and we know from the details of his life in the show that like he couldn't keep a job and money was a problem. So once he was kicked out of his grandma's house, he was gonna live somewhere shitty.
And yeah, and they kind of make it seem like this is this plan. Like he's like, oh, it's like he read an article and he's like, oh, I did. I'm now aware that black neighborhoods have incompetent police, so that's where I will go. I think it was more just that's where he ended up.
Yeah, I find your version much more plausible.
But it is probably pretty crazy. You find yourself in that environment, and the show depicts like the bathhouses and the bars, which was like, yeah, they're very, it was like a very unregulated environment. Like it's
I don't what years is this that we're it's like 1984 or something.
his span of killings was like 78 to 91, but like
Oh, okay.
but 78 was like this first one or two killings, and then he waited like 8 years or so. So it's like late 80s and late 70s.
Yeah, because I was thinking to myself, from like the little I know about this world, I was like, would you even get kicked out of a bathhouse for roofing people?
Yeah,
Like maybe.
yeah, I don't know. I thought that depiction of like the whisper network of the bathhouses was interesting.
Well, it's just that like the guy who hosted or whatever is like so indignant that someone would
Yeah,
engage in an ethical infraction in his bathhouse.
yeah, in his licensed and regulated bathhouse. I think we both felt it was. I felt it was double as long as it should have been. I think you felt it didn't justify its existence really.
Yeah, like I don't think there was a an idea worth pursuing that I
Yeah,
saw on screen.
in terms of a production, I did think that the main kid, what's his real name? Evan Peters, I think is his name. Um, I thought it was a good performance. I mean, he was like, he's playing a dullard, but
Yeah, it's very consistent. Like the verbal and physical tics he adopted in the accent. Like it's I think it's a good perform. I don't know how to judge it because it's like there's no I don't feel any like depth of the
mhm.
character, but to some extent, like you said, if you're playing like a dumb person, it's almost like the context that would supply. I mean, people have also commented that it's like it's very well staged and directed, and I guess the guy who directed it is somewhat famous. And like
It,
I do agree that from like a production value point of view, it like looks really good and really, high level or whatever.
well,
And I
one
and I think the main guy being a good actor helps that sense of prestige.
yeah, I think this was created by the American Horror Story guide. Right? Did you ever watch that show?
I've seen like the odd episode, but I never watched a full season.
Okay, yeah, same. I'd like started it once, and then that's as far as I got. But and I know those shows. I think it's like soap opera horror, I guess, or something like that. But
Yeah, and
um,
that show was very much like a feast for the eyes. There'd be like crazy costumes and monster effects and stuff.
yeah, this Dahmer show. Something though that was found very hard to watch though was the every scene was like orange.
Yeah, orange and dark.
Yeah, and it's like I know you're poor and living in this apartment, but what is your lighting that bad? Why is your lighting so bad? Why is lighting bad everywhere you go, except for like outside? But even then, it was weird. That I actually found that very oppressive. Like this like kind of like soaked in urine look of the whole show.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure they would say this was on purpose and part of the point, but it's like I found it a very unpleasant world to be in. The world that they create, and like I think I'm willing to go with a movie or a show on that if it's like showing me interesting things in this dark shitty world. But like once you're because they the opposite can be true where like a show that's not interesting but the world is fun, that can be like worth watching. um
Yeah. The other thing they jumping around chronologically is something that happens often in shows that are trying to be smart. Um, and
yeah, and shows that need to pad, I think.
yeah, and they and I'm okay with chronologically jumping around, but they do it so much, and like and it's like they'll go from like 19. The show starts with like one of his last victims, not his last, or it is his last victim, isn't it? Because that guy gets away.
Yeah,
So the show starts with his last almost victim, so 1991. But then they jump back to like 78. Okay, that's a normal thing to do, right? Is like show us kind of like where things end. Like movies do this all the time. That's fine. They show you the end, and then they show you how you got to the end. That would have been fine, but then they like go back to the modern part again, and then they go to the middle, and then they go to the end, and then they go to the beginning. Like they jump around way too much to the point where it's like, um, even if you're paying attention, it gets a little confusing, and it's not really in service of anything. It's just I think
I also think it's really cheap to like the way they I feel like this is a really pointed ideological thing to be like, oh, this episode isn't going to start with Dahmer. It's going to start with the victim's family. So you see like how rich and deep, like the humanity of this life he took is, and it's like I think that's a good thing to do, but it's like you have to, again, like the deaf guy that they showed, he was just like an unrealistically perfect
Yeah.
character. So it's like I didn't really. I almost think I would have liked it more if he had like a strained relationship with his family or something, or like something about him that wasn't just like, oh, this was the greatest guy that ever lived, and then Jeff Dahmer killed him.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think they well, I'm about to say something that might totally be wrong, but they depict that guy as like being up and coming, like that deaf guy, like he's really young, he wants to be a model. But I think he was actually like Dahmer's like oldest victim. Like he was not really. I mean, not that not that it matters, but they they depict him as having, I guess, maybe more potential in life than he did. Which isn't to say he deserved to be killed. It's just that that it was a weird change. But I might be wrong, and I
Well,
might be.
yeah, all these people, and like I don't want to be like a total, because they touch upon like the whole like HIV thing in the show, like
Hmm.
people getting tested and finding out where they have it or not. And it's like, yeah, I'm not questioning the humanity of these people, but like they're showing all these guys who have like dynamic social and professional lives who just happen to be gay. When I'm pretty sure like the scene at a bathhouse or like an underground gay bar at that time would be like everybody's using drugs, everybody's HIV infected, like totally at the margins of society. It's not like you're doing your homework with your sister who you have a great relationship with and kissing your Christian mother goodbye and then like going to the gay bar. Like I don't it's barely like that now. I don't think it was like that in 1980.
Yeah.
And again, like that's where the show is again undermining its own point because it's like you're trying to say he picked people off from the margins of society, but you don't have the balls to actually show the victims at the margins of society.
Yeah. Good.
You make them look like totally normal middle class people.
Yeah. Good point. Um. Yeah. I mean, well, on that, they you remember the controversy where like Netflix categorized the show as being like an LGBT show. Did
Yeah,
you see that?
yeah.
And people were mad because they're like, well, Dahmer, he's not an icon that we want, you know. And I get that, but it actually, even from like the point of view of the world, it would still make sense to be categorized as an LGBT show because that's who his victims were, and that's like the whole thing takes place in that community. Like, um, again,
Well, I don't want to scandalize your listeners, but I do have gay friends, and for better or worse, both of them texted me to watch this show and that it was quote sexy. So like I wonder if the reason they removed that is because it was getting like the wrong kind of LGBT heat. Like I wonder if like one too many, fab queens on Twitter were like tweeting like I would have gone home with Dahmer and they were like, "Okay, let's nip this in the bud. Like this isn't good."
yeah. Well, oh yeah, people positive reaction to the actor. People really like him, and Dahmer himself
Yeah,
was.
I guess people just think that guy's handsome. I guess that's what that was because like the show itself is definitely not sexy. Like even if you're a totally depraved lunatic, it's
Yeah,
like you said, it's like piss drenched.
yeah. Well, the actor is very handsome, but Dahmer
Well,
himself.
all Evans are.
Yeah, some pictures of Dahmer he looks a little goofy, but some of them he looks pretty handsome too. So, and not that it was necessarily hard to convince a guy to go home with you back then, or even now. But
Yeah, it's one another interesting thing in the show that I'd be curious about is like they play it as if Dahmer is very unconvincing that he's a photographer and that
uh
and that basically the gay guys were just like this guy's just corny, he just wants to have sex with you, but like his line is that
the
he's a
yeah
photographer. And it'd be interesting to know in real life like was he a dumbass even to that degree? Like he thought he had this slick excuse, but the gay guys were just like, "Oh yeah, we thought he just wanted sex." Like no one believed he was a photographer.
yeah. So, yeah, yeah. That actually is a good point about cowardice of not showing this community how it really is because it's very weird for them. to show like, oh, this guy is very normal. He has got normal friends and normal relationships, but he gets to an apartment that smells like, whatever that smells like, I guess. But there's rotting flesh in the apartment. He gets there and there's like literally blood like on mattresses and stuff. But he
Right, and the
stays.
deaf guy is setting like really healthy relationship boundaries. He's
Yeah,
like he's like I'm not a hookup guy. It's
yeah,
it's like yeah, he's smelling rotting flesh and being like I'm in it for this love thing.
yeah. Well, and that's just so inconsistent because it's like, well, which one is it? Is he part of a depraved underground scene? Because if he was, then I can see that why he would stay in this like vile environment. But if he's this like upstanding guy that you want to think he is, like he would have just turned right around.
Yeah, yeah, because you do sort of. I mean, I found myself asking like, the first scene we see, which is the guy that eventually catches him. It's like his suspicion senses are up, and it makes the rest of the show a little hard to accept because
Yeah,
we see that the last guy, but the guy that we see first is like, this shit smells bad. You're a weirdo. Like, what's going on? And then
yeah,
it's like, oh yeah, why was this able to last for 13 years or whatever?
yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking about this now. Like this show is so popular. I'm gonna upload this to YouTube, and it's gonna get views. Um, from just general fans of the show. From it, like some of my videos have gone up, and if it gets like in the algorithm, it'll get like 10,000 views. Um, it'll be fun. I'm very curious to see what happens if people find this and they're just like, wait, what? You're not allowed to. So
Well,
they're
maybe I mean I don't know if you'll split them up, but our up top 40 minutes of siding with Kanye against the Jews maybe will weed out some. I don't know.
yeah. Most people only listen to a minute anyway, but if they get to the middle in the end, they'll be like, "Is this a Dahmer apologist podcast?" How did you? So the end. Um, Dahmer really goes out the way they show. Basically, there was a schizo guy in jail who felt called by God to eliminate Dahmer, and he did. Um,
Yeah, I mean this is the obvious reactionary point, but like we don't need to, regardless of what the show says. I mean, I'm perfectly willing to. If God was talking to people in prison, he'd probably tell them to kill Dahmer. I mean, maybe the
yeah,
guy was also a schizophrenic, but uh, you know, that seems like something God might ask somebody to do.
yeah. No, I like that. They gave that character more time than I anticipated, and they showed him wrestling with God, even like praying, like, "What should I do? What should I do about
No,
this?"
and I loved the scene where he was like, I, as a religious person, it was very satisfying to see him go up to Dahmer and be like, "You're not repentant, and it's offensive to me.
Yeah,
So, like, if you keep walking around like sort of into this, like, I'm gonna kill you." Like
yeah,
that makes his whole motivation appear much more substantial.
yeah. Maybe that would have been a more interesting show. Just that guy, his thing.
Yeah, that guy's super clever. He manipulates the librarian effectively.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, for anyone who's listening to this who didn't actually watch it, Dahmer goes to prison and he's getting fan mail. He's playing up his persona as just for giggles, but he's just like making jokes about eating people, and the other prisoners are upset with him, and yeah, this one guy decides to take care of that.
Yeah, I'm sort of interested. Like, it's a cliche in movies that like child killers and child molesters are hated in prison
Uh
and
huh.
often murdered. But this show did have me wondering, like, I guess like the vast majority of criminals are just sort of like they're involved in like the regular run of the mill crime, and I wonder if serial killers are sort of like social outcasts in
Yeah,
prison.
we do want to sort of believe in like these it's always fun like in fiction, something like The Wire, right? To like say to believe in like the noble criminal, it's like, well, he
Mhm.
will kill someone else in another gang, over a small dispute, like over like a parking space, um, but he, he loves his mother and will kill a pedophile in jail. So we like
Well,
to
right.
believe.
I think what you're referencing is true, but I think it's also easy to imagine that like you could be a completely bad person who might like kill somebody over a dispute, but still wouldn't understand someone who just needed to kill,
Yeah,
like periodically.
yeah,
Um, because it is like it probably is like weird and disturbing to be in the presence of such a person, I would guess.
yeah, yeah. Um, all right. Well, I mean, it's pretty obvious if you listen to this whole thing and you didn't watch the show. I'd say it's pretty obvious you don't really need to watch it. I mean, uh, I think you liked it less than I did. Like you liked it not at all. I guess I don't know what it is. Maybe just my like going back to my like. It was kind of more, I guess, a teenage phase of being interested in these in serial killers, but um, I did find myself kind of like curious, like, okay, well, where's this going to go next? Because I didn't know a bunch about Dahmer actually, um, but anyway, I mean, no one needs to watch this really. It's you read the Wikipedia about Dahmer if you want to know, um, but that's that's about it.
Yeah, yeah, and it does take a while. Yeah, if it was 4 hours, like you said, I'd tell people like, whatever, like bang it out, see if you like it. But given how long it is, I think I'd encourage people not to bother.
Yeah, and Netflix execs have been upfront about this. They're like, our goal is to keep people on platform, which means like padding our shows to make them longer. So if it takes you, you know, 4 days to finish a show instead of three, that's a win for us.
Well, yeah, somebody told me recently that like 14% of the total internet's bandwidth is devoted to people watching Netflix.
Yeah, I think it's
So
like in the evenings. Like in the evenings, like a third of the internet is just streaming.
that's so insane.
Okay, well, I have nothing else to say about this show. All right, so thanks to Degree Studies for joining us. Check the description. I'll have links to his Twitter, his podcast. When's your next podcast coming out? I'll probably have this. Today is November 1st. I'll have probably have this out by November 2nd.
Okay, yeah, then people should just look for a new pod from me this week. I probably won't get it. I've recorded one. It's in the can, as they say. I probably won't get it out tomorrow, but maybe Thursday or Friday.
Okay, cool.